Hello, Jason. Today is Friday, March 28th, and as you know, today is my first badass Motha Friday, and I'm going to start off with someone who, quite frankly, has helped shape the world. Without this person, the fates of the United States of America, Great Britain, and France would all be vastly different. And quite frankly, his contributions to one of the most important movements in history, the Enlightenment, makes him, in my mind, one of the most important people to have ever lived. I'm talking, of course, about T-Paine. Not that T-Paine, this T-Paine, Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine is an English-born American writer and political figure who was born in 1737. He lived in Great Britain until his 30s when he moved to the United States because he felt that the old world relied too much on birth rather than merit for determining success. In particular, he felt that the monarchy and aristocracy in most of the European nations were holding back the population as a whole. Having developed a general attitude of rebellion and moving to America, he became a quick advocate for issues like anti-slavery and American independence from Great Britain. And it was in support of his passion to see America independent from Great Britain that he published a book called Common Sense, anonymously, which sold more than 500,000 copies. To put that in perspective, the population of the British colonies in North America was only slightly above 2 million people at the time, and about 500,000 of those were black slaves who weren't allowed to own property. So in a white population of 1.7 million people, there were 500,000 copies of this book out there. Which makes it sort of hard to imagine that there were very many people who hadn't either read or had read to them a copy of Thomas Paine's work. One of the key reasons for the success of Common Sense was its style. It was written in a way that wasn't intimidating to the common man. For millennia, the written word had been locked away for the common man because learning to read was seen as a privilege of the upper classes alone. But, thanks in large part to the highly Protestant population of the United States, reading was encouraged as a way to explore the Bible for yourself, and so literacy rates rose hugely. The result being that people could finally read things for themselves instead of having to be told what was happening in the world. The other key selling feature of Common Sense was, quite frankly, its content. Thomas Paine managed to lay out methodically and logically all of the arguments for the United States leaving British control and gaining their own independent status. So the American common population who read Common Sense were invigorated, and this, in many ways, was one of the key moments in the American Revolution. In fact, if you're so inclined and have the time, I encourage you to read Common Sense and then review the American Declaration of Independence. What you'll find is that, when writing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson borrowed extremely heavily from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In fact, almost everything mentioned in the Declaration of Independence corresponds to an argument made by Thomas Paine. And thus, he changed North America forever. Unfortunately, all was not well for Thomas Paine. While, for a short time, he was heralded as a national hero for the newly formed United States of America, he soon lost favor because he had some pretty radical opinions. Particularly regarding his views on Christianity, which he felt, as an organized religion, relied too much on blind faith and dogma. Both of which he felt were extremely negative qualities for a religion to have in the desire to connect with an almighty creator. In fact, as a part of the tradition called deism, he believed that the universe was created, but that the creator was no longer present. And so, in his view, the only way that we could infer anything about God was through the clues that he left behind, the rules of nature. And so, rather than relying on what he saw as a dogmatic holy book, he felt that investigating, questioning, and using logic were the ways to the divine. These ideas, unfortunately, didn't take him too far in the United States, especially when he was voicing them so publicly. And so, after helping to incite the revolution which changed a continent, he returned to his native land of England, where, as it was his nature, he stirred up some more trouble. Having returned to a country which he originally left because of the massive inequality between the aristocracy and monarchy and the common people, he found his passions renewed. And having experienced moderate success with his work Common Sense, he decided to employ a similar strategy for this problem in England. He began work on a two-part book called Rights of Man, which argued that hereditary power wasn't real power at all. And thus, the masses comprised of the common people needn't follow the orders of those sitting on thrones in nations all across Europe. Quite frankly, his argument wasn't that different to the one he presented in Common Sense. All he claimed was that power should reside with the majority. In other words, he was peddling what we today consider to be democracy, at least in an idealized form. But of course, those who were in power, the ones who had the most to lose from Thomas Paine's work, couldn't allow such ideas to stand. And so, a warrant was put out for his arrest, which forced him to flee to France. And while he was in France, he was tried in absentia, which means basically they held a trial without him there. And in this trial, he was found guilty of seditious libel against the crown, the penalty for which was hanging. And so to ever return to England would be to submit to certain death. Unfortunately for the crown and the aristocracy, Thomas Paine never did return to England, but he did continue to publish there through a number of his friends in the publishing industry. And his ideas, along with the ideas of a number of other philosophers around the area at the time, managed to take root, and England experienced a reformation. And thus a second country was irrevocably changed in part by Thomas Paine. But of course, he just couldn't stop there. Now effectively a political refugee in France, his thoughts turned again to religion, and he began writing a book called The Age of Reason. It was originally conceived in 3 parts, but the part that particularly interests me was part 2, which he published in England through a man named Thomas Williams. The book itself was condemned, just like his previous book, The Rights of Man, but he had a strategy for getting it to as many people as possible. Through his publisher, he managed to create an extremely cheap version of the book, costing only 3 pennies, when a normal book would cost upwards of a shilling. Don't ask me to explain Imperial British currency, I have no idea how it works. And so, for the crime of making Thomas Paine's radical works widely accessible, Thomas Williams was put on trial. That's right, Thomas Paine's works were considered so dangerous by the British aristocracy that they tried the publisher for having the gall to publish it. The irony of this is, if the book were simply published as a more expensive edition, there would have been no trouble whatsoever. In fact, I have 2 quotations from a statement made by the prosecution in the trial against Thomas Williams, which prove this point. They read as follows: "An intellectual book, however erroneous, addressed to the intellectual world upon so profound and complicated a subject, can never work the mischief which this indictment is calculated to repress." Effectively, this statement claims that if the book were aimed at the aristocracy, it wouldn't be dangerous, because the aristocracy have no reason to fight against themselves. But even more revealing is the second quotation, which reads as follows: "It stirs up men without the advantages of learning or sober thinking to a total disbelief of everything hitherto held sacred, and consequently to a rejection of all the laws and ordinances of the state, which stand only upon the assumption of their truth." What this quotation essentially reveals is that Thomas Williams' crime, according to the prosecution, is simply revealing to the people that they're being screwed over. So long as the common people believe that the laws of the land are ordained by a higher power, essentially the monarchy, then they have no reason to fight for their own freedom. And so we can see the political landscape that Thomas Paine was fighting against, one that encourages people to fight against their own freedom in the name of some higher power. For those who are wondering, Thomas Williams was convicted in his trial and was sentenced to 1 year of hard labor. But something else was stirring, which would force Thomas Paine into another massive political move. The French Revolution was coming to a head, and Thomas Paine, who was against capital punishment, spoke out against the execution of Louis the something-teenth. And thus he was given a label which he never in his wildest dreams imagined he would have to bear: sympathizer to the crown. And along with this title, he was imprisoned and marked for execution as an enemy of the state. Now, rumor has it that he narrowly escaped the guillotine because his cell number was smudged on an execution order. But it's more likely that he was protected by the American ambassador to France and future 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, who helped Thomas Paine, a former colleague of his, to escape France and repatriate to the United States, where this man who had changed so much in the world that he found unjust lived unhappily and broke for the rest of his days. The end. And now, really quick challenge update. I finished reading The Fault in Our Stars, which I'll review at the same time that I review Pet Sematary in a later video, when I have more time. And I've started reading The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, which I think is going to be one of my favorite books so far this year. At least that's the impression I get from the first 100 pages or so, which I've read so far. As well, I've taken some of the minor preliminary steps to getting back into writing my novel, so hopefully I can see a lot of progress on that front relatively soon. Also, I'm pretty sure that this goes without saying, but weather, nicer, running more. And now, Battleship. I have exciting news for you, Jason. Your attack on G3 was a hit. I hope that one day I too will feel the same exhilaration, maybe as I attack G5.